Okay, guys, we're going to continue in our work with unpacking the standards, the new standards that have come out for ELA. And since we're all people who are involved in teaching 11th grade English here at Fulton, we decided to just get together and talk about these standards. So, Ms. Lanzoni, which standard are we going to talk about today?
I think we are going to unpack RI.IKI.8.
Okay. Okay, RI.IKI.8.
So evaluate how an author incorporates evidence and reasoning to support the argument and specific claims in the text.
That is right.
I'm going to type it in here.
Okay. So what is this standard about? I mean, what is it saying? What did it used to be in the former standards, and what is it asking the students to do, to know and be able to do?
This is one of the few that's changed quite a bit.
Right. The previous standard was being very specific about what kind of text. So specifically like the U.S. Constitution and seminal, text to American history. And this one does not specify what kind of text besides informational. That's a big shift.
Okay, and you can see from the way the standards are set up, a lot of the reading standards, there's a correlation between literature and informational text, and this one is not applicable to literature. So this is kind of like an informational text standard that stands on its own. So what is it asking the students to know and be able to do?
Well, it asks them to evaluate. So that would be, knowledge would be how to evaluate.
Okay. When you say knowledge, what is?
Knowledge, like what do they have to know? Like
Okay,
they have
so
to know what that means to evaluate.
Okay.
So if we ask them if we have an
Understand what that
objective that
task
says
is.
evaluate this, so they need to know what that means.
Okay. So we're talking about learning targets within the standard now.
Right.
So the first
Right.
So the knowledge.
type is the knowledge
Yeah.
learning target. So what kind of vocabulary is involved? Evaluate, we've said.
The word incorporate.
What's considered evidence?
Mhm. Claim.
And how to identify, I guess, the argument. What is the argument?
Would we include rhetorical modes, so like cause and effect, argument,
Just how they
compare and
incorporate their
contrast, how they are
evidence.
incorporating
Right.
evidence, because they have multiple options for doing that? Would we want to review those frameworks as a teacher?
So frameworks?
So we might say, you could say rhetorical modes, but I know that can get kind of confusing. So we could say frameworks or structures for.
I feel like a lot of the prompts say structures. All of the prompts I see say, what is the structure?
Yeah.
So maybe we want to use
So we
that
might
word.
say styles and evidence incorporation. I know
Right.
that's kind of clunky.
Well, if you look in the way the standards are laid out, we have K through 12.
Progresses
And
up.
you can see the progression.
Right.
And earlier, it does talk about the claims and reasons and evidence and evaluating the argument.
And so I might say like almost like the formula of how you do that would be that upper tier, right? That like you can incorporate it in one way where it's going to be cause and effect, and you're making an argument that it is causation. But then in another way of organizing it, you could be comparing and contrasting two ways to move forward. Or like, there's two schools of thought on this specific text. One's doing this while the other's arguing that this is being achieved. So reviewing a little bit of how stuff can be structured with them. I don't know what I would call that, like, because another way to bring evidence in might be classification. like, here are some examples of how
Right.
this works in other texts. That's another way to incorporate evidence. And if they see some of those basic styles, they'll know what to look for.
Right.
So is that a skill that,
I think the knowledge of that sometimes
have
it's
that knowledge
outlined
of
this way,
what
sometimes it's
Okay.
outlined that way, might be something worth reviewing before
Mhm.
we're putting these texts in front of them.
okay, so reviewing how you do that.
Yeah, similar to what we're saying with, you know, we would need to review what evidence is, we would need to review what constitutes a claim, what constitutes argument, right? I would say we need to review basic structures of how to incorporate evidence so that the students can see some of those different structures for how they're working.
Right,
Because there's lots of ways to incorporate evidence.
right.
Right now, they think like, well, I have a quote. It's like, but are you showing me an example? Or are you showing me how they're connected? Are you showing me how they're different?
Right.
Why are you using that quote?
Right.
So that would be more the identifying before they can evaluate. So that does build up. So they can identify the structure, and then the next step would be to push them towards evaluating what
Right.
that structure does. Okay.
But if we're gonna evaluate, we gotta know basic structures of
Right.
how it can happen at all.
Mhm.
And in the 7th grade, you can see they trace and evaluate. And then 8th grade, it changes to delineate and evaluate. And
Mhm.
9, 10, evaluate. And, 11, 12, evaluate, incorporate, and support the argument. So that's how we would scaffold that for kids. How do we get them there? How do we get them to be able to do that?
Are you asking like for like approaches in the classroom? So I think it's possible that we can use shorter, close reads of like, let's look at these two paragraphs. What does it seem like is happening, or why are they going through this example?
I think you have to teach it very specifically. So if the standard is asking them to evaluate how the author incorporates that evidence, and Sandy is making a really good point about there's different ways to do that, and they should be able to know those different ways, then I think show them text that show the 3 different ways and compare them to each other, and do you see how this is happening and how you would talk about this?
And I might do it like, yeah,
Right.
in close reads, like smaller chunks, so it's not, let me throw 5 big texts at you.
Right.
Well, I
It's
feel like
let's
there's
get
some
way down in there.
good examples in like the book, Everything's an Argument. There's some
Yeah.
great breakdown of these different ways to use an argument, and I think that would be useful to tackle. Because a lot of it's much more accessible than some of the harder seminal
Yes.
United States historical.
So I'm gonna
arguments.
add that to the comments, like
Mhm.
pull text from everything is an argument.
Okay, so everything is an argument, is not gonna be your text, it's a tool to help
Right.
you with text. Okay. So in terms of reasoning and skill,
Compare.
it's the thought process.
And summarize, they have to summarize what the argument is, and it might be to compare, like, the way that they talk about different things. Depending on the level with reasoning, it could be asking them all of those things or just some of them,
Okay.
right?
Right.
So,
Well, evaluate, that, I mean, it's part of the standard, that's a reasoning skill.
yeah,
You're gonna be able to justify.
Justify why whatever evidence they used was appropriate.
I mean, they're also gonna have to, there's a certain amount of critique as well, it's like, was this, in order to evaluate how they incorporated this, they're gonna have to be able to tell you, is it effective or not?
right,
Right.
yeah. Well, and we've seen writing prompts that ask that specifically,
Mhm.
and is it effective? So, yeah, okay, so evaluate, critique effectiveness. Definitely like summarize what is the argument in the first place, analyze.
Okay, and the skill in this standard.
The skills are the one we always get a little
Yeah,
tripped up on.
So the skill is that they have to demonstrate understanding of the use of an argument, or understanding how an author makes their argument.
Right.
And to do, they have to demonstrate that they can evaluate. Like, that's a
Yes.
skill. Yeah.
So how do they do that? I mean, what can you use to have the student prove that they can do that?
So like the product?
What product can they create to demonstrate that skill?
And I feel like it could be a presentation, an essay.
It could be a shorter writing piece, it could be class discussion,
Right.
graphic organizer.
Rhetorical analysis can
Oh,
help
yeah.
us like focus on them evaluating in which ones do you see as most effective. If we've gone through all these examples, where do you feel like they're really hitting it home with their audience?
Right.
So that just furthers the evaluation process for the student.
So you're talking about pieces of writing and also speaking and listening things.
Mhm.
For the writing, we know, the traditional ways to evaluate that, but how would you evaluate, say, a class discussion? And in order to give the student feedback as to how well they did. And I know we have class discussions every day, formal and informal, but what types of class discussions can you have and how would you evaluate it?
Well, I think you could bring up an example on the smartboard to look at together and call upon students to say, well, what do you think's happening here? Okay, great answer, Jeremiah. How could you add on to that, Ms. Desiree? And to kind of get, so that informal assessment of an idea, as well as, you could set up a more formal assessment with discussion as well, where everyone has to speak at least once. What's that double circle thing?
The Venn diagram?
Or
Fishbowl,
Socratic.
Socratic, well, fishbowl's what's usually what I was thinking of, but yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting, yeah.
Mhm.
You could also have them do some type of like almost debate, like which one of the, do you think that he made a solid argument? Okay, why? Yeses and nos. And then they're also having to use evidence to prove whether they think that the other author used evidence.
There can also be like preliminary work done ahead of class. So if we're gonna have, I think debate is a good format for that, where the students can be graded on the questions that they're submitting before class. And then the teacher is getting to select the ones that they like the best for discussion. So you're getting a participation, like are you talking, stuff like that. But then also evaluating the kinds of questions students are asking and like what they're wanting to explore with one another to continue to, facilitate even just good questioning for students, right? If they're driving their own questions and increasing that personal interest or, right?
You could also break them up into smaller groups and put the text in a Google Doc. The students then have to go on and make their comments and questions and
Right.
annotate.
I don't know, we do something similar to document a conversation, and we do the think, talk, write. So, they have a second to think about it, and then they record their answer. So at least I have that, and we usually do it in a Google Doc, so that, it's live, and we can always access it, and then they share it out. So, and sometimes it makes kids a little more comfortable if they have that think time.
Most of the time,
Yeah.
And Socrative, the website has a piece where students can submit questions or ideas that then can get voted on. So the ones that the class likes and wants to go forward with, you can also move them forward that way. You're just like, okay, these are a lot of really good questions. Why don't you start to vote on the ones that where do you want to go next? So if we're gonna have class discussion.
We have some good interactive ways. So I guess now that we've talked a little bit about what this looks like, what kind of texts or text sets would you use with this? You mentioned, was that you, Beth, you said that previously it had been very much defined what to use in the standard. And now there is no limitation or perceived limitation as to what you can use. What might be good to use with this standard?
I think current events articles could be really useful, and a great resource is Kelly Gallagher's Article of the Week. So if you just Google that, he pulls out a current event article once a week, and usually from like places like the New York Times and our AP. And so they're really relevant, and they help build students' background knowledge about things. So it could be a good way to like get that little bit of practice in before you hit a bigger, larger piece like an MLK speech or.
That's what I was gonna say, speeches specifically would be really good with this, because usually that's what they struggle with sometimes, and so having that. is a piece.
I've also found with speeches, there's a lot of, at the junior and senior level, a lot of access points because they're familiar with some of the style tools. So they can kind of look at metaphors being used in a speech. They can look at parallel structure. And so I've found that the motivation to continue to participate, even when we move into higher order thinking, is there because they feel like, well, I understand this part of it. And so they can kind of continue to contribute as we move forward into evaluating, like, okay, so that's a simile. Now what do we do?
Michaela Griffin, please come to the main office. Michaela Griffin.
So I think allowing them to feel some sort of ownership and authority on different kinds of devices that get used, and then how that's being used and what it is accomplishing.
Right.
So that's helpful.
Plus with speeches, they're able to read it and hear it, so they have like different accesses to it, which will help them understand it and explore it more.
Right, and if you give them some current speeches, I mean, that's gonna help them when we get into some of the, you know, like Patrick Henry and some of the more seminal texts. I mean, I know they're not mentioned anymore, but the next one actually, it says, you know, historically significant.
Right.
So, you know, they're in there somewhere.
Well, there's also, the New York Times also has short documentary film, which most of them are
Right.
making a kind of argument about something. Like, for
Right.
example, my students watched one about a girl in Afghanistan who's trying to postpone getting married so she can finish school. So how are they visually making an argument for why is this
Right.
child's going to postpone? So you can still analyze that and evaluate, like, what are the devices they're using visually to get this
Right.
idea across. So.
And if we think about short activities to build kind of these muscles, trailers are really good too. So if you look at documentary trailers, they're usually presenting an issue and the two sides,
Right.
and usually there's even bias or slant. So it's like, does this movie seem like it's pro or con this? And being able to evaluate how they're establishing that through media can be a quick activity to build that confidence, and then start to move towards like, well, these older texts that are important to our culture or our democracy are no different, right? They were making a similar
You
argument.
get a lot of buy-in in those. Kids love it.
That makes me think of the Super Bowl commercials. There were a lot of
Oh, yeah.
commercials that seem to have a specific message, and maybe compare one of those with a historical text.
Lumber 84 or 84 lumber.
84 lumber,
Yeah.
Well, and I'm also wondering, I like Beth's idea about current events. Some of the mention recently of like dissent memos and the idea that we can also like look at position pieces from other parts of our country's history. So like, what did the administration at that time say about this issue? What were their prepared statements? And so being able to choose what feels like it naturally connects with older pieces as another way to build interest, that we're still having this conversation. And so potentially look at that too.
And did we talk about the form and structure and being a part of this in evaluation, that how the author incorporates evidence and how form plays into that?
Like cause and effect? Yeah, we talked about that, about an option to like review those ideas before we started working with those texts. Are you seeing a connection?
Well, I'm just thinking about the form of some of the historical documents and the way they were disseminated in the past.
Yeah, like text
Pamphlets,
structures and
The
things
text
like
of the
that.
pamphlets, which
Yeah.
took a while to circulate around the country, whereas now we have instantaneous 140 characters.
I was just thinking about
Yeah.
that.
Right, yeah. I still like the idea that we had from last time when the standard was more directed at U.S., historical texts, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Statements analysis, and like the companion texts that go along with them explaining the analysis, because then you're still getting historical document and practice with that because our standards are aligned with US history. But it's something more modern, something that might be more them. Seeing it. It's important to look at the longer text too.
What if Patrick Henry had Twitter? What would he be tweeting right now?
So, do we see our students getting to this point? Because we are the cap of what they're supposed to be able to know and be able to do. Can we get our kids here
Yes.
with what we talked about?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments or anything you want to add?